Hi there, welcome to part two of a discussion around building habits of celebration and lament into our lives as followers of Jesus. So, just sort of zooming out a little bit from with, with regard to those two things, um, what are some of the sort of the biggest theological ideas that maybe help frame these ideas of celebration and lament, sort of big picture, um, bigger sort of narrative ideas?
Sure. Yeah, well, we have this thing called hope as Christians that, it's a whole topic all on its own, whole other podcast. But I think the Christian hope that one day all suffering will end, this future promise that we hold on to with sometimes gritted teeth and
Yeah.
hands grasped, but it's something that is literally an anchor for us, I think. And so this hope that we have really helps reframe our earthly hardships. It puts them in a different perspective. We can have this literal heavenly perspective where we're encouraged. I think I've got it written here, 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17 and 18. It tells us our light and momentary troubles, not that they feel momentary sometimes,
Or light, yeah.
or light, but I mean, this is Paul writing, and we know what he went through, right? Our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. And so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And so, I mean, I love those verses because they really help us see with a heavenly perspective the things that we're going through, and some people's experiences of trouble, like it's lifelong. It doesn't feel short or temporary at all, or light or momentary, and yet we're told that in the perspective of heaven, in eternity's perspective, that this is achieving for us an eternal glory, and it's something that we're encouraged to lift our eyes and see differently. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? It's so counterintuitive. Somehow we can experience, just as you talked about, like lifting your heart in gratitude in the midst of a complaint, that we're somehow able to find some semblance of joy or thanksgiving in the midst of sorrow and difficulty.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think in the New Testament, particularly in Paul's letters, how prominent heaven is in his thinking. Even the famous, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Like everything about Paul is framed by his total confidence of heaven. And I was thinking today, I just don't think I live like that most of the time, like with that as my solid framework. But if that is part of the bigger theological framework that you live within, then heaven really, it fuels your celebration, I think, and it frames your lament and your hardship, because it's this huge hope that we carry, and I think I don't think about that enough, I think, in terms of actually one day God is gonna make all things new. Or when I do think about it, it's quite vague, because there's not loads and loads of like specific detail, like this is how we can paint the picture of heaven, this is what it's going to look like exactly, because it's not like that. It becomes this concept that's important but kind of vague. But actually, I think for Paul, it's important, and it's not vague. It's very central, and it's and the thing that frames his ability to sort of to walk through some of the most terrible things. But I think it fuels celebration, and it frames lament and hardship.
Yeah.
What about you, John? Any other things to theological?
So when I was thinking around it, is that when we think about the world that we see around us, like in the immediate, in our relationships, our families, our church, our wider community, and then the world, and then you think about say the persecuted church, is one of these that comes to mind for me is like, do I have a theology that, if you like, that can bear the weight of that? and if I don't, then I need to find one, because the reality is at some point in life. So some people, as Steph was saying, it can be an ongoing suffering that's happening. So some of us, it can be momentary in the physical sense, but the reality is that we need a theology that can bear the weight of that. And I remember it was a few weeks ago, you and I went to see someone in hospital, and it was on a Sunday morning, and on the way back we were having a conversation about that, and it happened to be that it was when the service was happening, and I can't remember exactly how the conversation went, but essentially it was almost that there was a sense of, if God isn't present in hospital where people are suffering in so many ways, he's not present in what we do on what was happening at exactly the same time. And the wonder is that he is present in both, and but us needing to remember that, so that when we're having those times of celebration and praise and worship, one of the things, we're not just having a holy huddle experience. We're acknowledging that God is present in the room where we're praising God, and he's present in all those places of suffering. And so for us, in terms of in the Vineyard, we would have a theology of the kingdom, that for some listening, this may be new, in terms of those that may be new to church. For others, it may be quite well worn in terms of understanding, but this sense of, through that, we see the world through the eyes of the kingdom of God, God's rule and reign in the world, and that through Jesus, God's kingdom has come, but it has not fully come. It's not fully been fulfilled.
So we use that language of the now and the not yet.
The now and now and the not yet, and we can, and for me, that was when I first heard that, it was a really helpful framework in terms of understanding life. But there's sometimes the potential that I can misunderstand that, and it can almost become a bit transactional. So like when good things happen, oh, that's the now. Yeah. When bad things happen, that's the not yet. And it's not actually as clear cut as that, because when you see someone, often God's presence, God's kingdom coming is in the midst of the suffering. So, but the framework is really helpful. But the reality is, there is also part of our theology is not just of the now and the not of the kingdom. There's also a theology of suffering, that actually the Bible and Jesus talked about suffering, and that suffering will be part of our journey.
Yeah, and in this world you will have trouble. It's not like you might do, you may do. It's you will.
Yeah, and so it's not just this transactional. Sometimes it will go well, sometimes it won't. There's a deeper thing. There's a deeper element to it of, actually, no, this is part of your. If you're going to walk with me,
yeah,
then you're going to suffer.
You had a great story you're telling me the other day. I think it's a John Wimber story.
Oh, yeah. So it was probably about 30 years ago. Donna and I went to a conference in London, and John Wimber was speaking, and the conference was called "Walking Through the Valley of the Shadow of Death," and it came out of his experience of having had cancer and what have you. And he told this story of this lady that a friend of his, that he'd known for many years and walked through things with, and they'd done ministry together and everything. And she had cancer, and John Wimber did many things, but one of the things he'd seen over the years is saw many people healed in different ways. And this lady, she came to the point in her cancer treatment where the doctor said to her, well, you could. There's this extra cancer treatment that you can have, but the reality is you'd have to travel somewhere else to have it. You'd be away from your family, and it would be, in terms of quality of life, it would be very impactful on you. And John Wimber, sort of in reflecting on this, he had this sense from God of God saying, "You've taught her how to live. Now you need to teach her how to die." And he went and he spoke to her, it sounds like very gently, and said, you could go for this treatment, or you could maybe have these last weeks and months with your family. And she chose not to have the treatment. And on the night, she was taken into. She ended up in hospital, and her family had come to see her, and at the end of as they left, she said, they said, "Oh, we'll see you tomorrow." And apparently she said something like, "Oh, you won't find much," or something, but they didn't particularly clock it. And she then got out of her bed and she went and she had a shower, and she put on a new night dress and she brushed her hair. And the nurse came back into the room and she said, "Oh, you're looking lovely." And she said, yes, I'm going to meet my king." And she went to sleep that night, and she died. And as he told that story, John, at the end of the story, he just said, "That's victory." And it's that thing, it's this understanding that, we have an eternal future, and it's not an eternal future of, oh, we get to go to heaven when we die. We have this eternal future of glory, of being fully in the presence of God, where there will be no more pain, there will be no more tears. And us being able to grasp that, or something of that, in the midst of the reality of life, means that this celebration and lament that we talk about is not, oh, it's good if we do have, let's add another practice to the things we do in life. It's actually, it's understanding reality, understanding that the here and now is the beginning of eternity.
Yeah, I love that. That's victory too. It's such that's really moving.
Yeah.
And I think it's really helpful. I think the now and the not yet framework, I think, is really helpful because it helps us see why is it that sometimes we see both beauty and and healing and help and all those things, and also we see brokenness, and how do we understand? And I think it helps us sort of sit in that space that, of course, if the now and the not yet, the kingdom has come, but it's not fully come, and so therefore we'll see wonderful moments of life and light, and we'll also see heartbreaking moments of death and brokenness. Both of that, all of that is going to be true as we journey through faith, and so we have to work out what it looks like to faithfully follow Jesus in a world where that's the reality that we live in. What's it look like to keep our hearts soft to Jesus and faithfully follow him in a now and not yet world?
Yeah, our Orthodox brothers and sisters, they have this phrase that's called these bright sadness.
Yeah.
And just that this sense that almost you can't unsee the things you see. Once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. You can't unknow what you know. But there's something of when we're able to engage with that hope, there can be a brightness and a lightness
in the midst,
so that the yoke we carry is actually well fitting.
Yeah.
And so we can journey through that. And sometimes you meet people who are the people I aspire to be like, are people who seem to be able to carry the sadness of life, but they carry it lightly because they and I want to be around those people because they bring that hope. And Leslie Newbigin said he was a missionary, and he was asked, "Are you an optimist or a pessimist?" And he said, "I'm neither an optimist or a pessimist. Jesus Christ rose from the dead."
Yeah.
And it just sums it all up.
I absolutely love that. I think so heaven is a big part of what it means to frame the ideas of lament and celebrating, and the kingdom and the now and the not yet is another important framework. But I think there are just two things I was going to sort of add to that, which I think helpful. But one is the death, resurrection, the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. I think is just obviously, I mean, we can't really be Christians without talking about, but to recognize that this isn't just those things aren't just like ideas or thoughts, but they are actually sort of truth claims that this actually happened in real history. And that's the thing that can be so frustrating, for people. But the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, I remember being in hospital, and all the other stuff, a lot of the sort of the Christian, the practice of how we do church or how others do church, or do you like this or that or not that or this, or should you do that 5 times or 3 times, all that stuff kind of went out the window because the hospital situation was so severe and so tricky. But the thing that I came down to again was this: do I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? I do. I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And so that means he's alive and he's with us. It doesn't mean this is going to work out the way I want it to work out necessarily. It doesn't mean any number of things, but it does mean that he's alive and he's with us. And so we're not without hope, no matter what. And so I think that Christ came, Christ died, Christ rose again is so important as a framework for every single thing that we do ever. It falls within the framework of, yes, this and this is hard, this and this is good, this and this is terrible, this is devastating. But no matter what it is, Christ came, Christ died, and Christ rose again. And I think that as a sort of unchanging ground beneath everything, framing your entire life and every single experience, is extraordinarily hopeful and helpful, even in the worst moments. So I think that is very important. And then the other thing I would just say is that the other thing to have in our minds is like the people that we are wanting to become. So the fruit of the Holy Spirit has become really, it's been something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and that we want to become people who are increasingly bearing fruit of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, gentleness, self-control, faithfulness, all those things, that we are people who are growing in those things. And so, and I think celebration and lament and those being practices in our lives are all part of what it looks like we use that language, keep in step with the Spirit. How do we keep in step with the Spirit? How do we walk hand in hand with him, and grow in his likeness? And I think all of these practices we looked at over the last 6 weeks are kind of ways to things we can build into our lives to sort of help us in that way. They don't change us in and of themselves. I used, I think in one of the talks, the image of solar panels on the roof. That it's like you tilt them towards the sun, and they don't generate. It's the sun. It's the power of the sun that changes anything. And so these things, these habits, these disciplines are almost like ways of tilting our lives to be open to the power of God to do whatever he wants to do in us. Anyway, so moving on, just kind of final things really. But I suppose one thing is helpful where do you see these things, strengths and weaknesses of these practices in the church? So not necessarily our church specific, but capital C church. How do you see these things functioning well or not well?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of strengths in terms of particularly around celebration. I think possibly the church does this very well. Each week we gather together, we worship. There's sort of Christian dates in the calendar, aren't there? Moments in the year where we celebrate, and I think they're not, we don't want to wash over those and say they're not good. They're really good practices, but I suppose where I think we could probably grow is in this area of sitting in the discomfort of lament. I was thinking about what you were sharing about the fact, that Jesus he died and he rose again. And I think in that sort of pattern or trajectory of his life, we sort of, as Christians, maybe want to rush too quickly to the resurrection language and the hope, part, and skip over that kind of Jesus died, and we're too called to take up our cross, and that we're actually told that the Christian life is promised to come with hardship and suffering and persecution. And so when we actually experience these things in our lives, you know, it can still take us by surprise. And you know, corporately, I think in the church, as we know it, I don't know that we have many ways in which we really corporately understand lament together and do that together. And I think that's something we can still be learning and growing in. Yeah.
What about you, John?
Yeah, and I think sometimes we can, you know, this thing around celebration, lament versus optimism, pessimism, and I think it's something just, I guess, just for us to guard against, or to be conscious of. Oh, so in the press, say, pushing into celebration, is it I'm seeking to, in some ways, are there times where there can be an avoidance in that, and that's in all of us, that we can do that. I think having practices of celebration and corporately, I think can be really helpful. And so things like, you know, as we, you know, next week will be, you know, soon Lent will be beginning, and having that, you know, the season of Lent, you know, the seasons of the year can be really helpful for us. And so as we go through Easter, you know, that we have, you know, we'll have closer on a Thursday, there's Good Friday, there's Saturday, there's Sunday, and I suppose finding ways that we sit in those moments, so we don't need to rush from Thursday to Friday to Saturday to Sunday, and so it's just, I suppose, us being aware of as a church community, that sometimes we can have a tendency to rush to celebration, and that's not in a critical way. It's just that sometimes we can easily tend to do that, and so I suppose as much as individually, it's important that we are aware of what's happening in us, is that we do that corporately as well, and so we journey with one another. I know we were talking the other day about some of the small things that we've tried to introduce to allow for that.
So I was going to say, I think in our church, there are definitely things that we've tried to do to sort of help create space for that, and I think you've been a really helpful part of that as well. And the small groups team, you know, really care about that side of things, and I think it's really good. From a sort of more sort of church-wide, sort of capital C church, I think there were definitely, you can see strengths in different areas, can't you? Like the contemplative tradition often has a lot of language around around this stuff, around sort of how we grieve and how we sit in discomfort, and what God does in the midst of those things in us and through us. And so I think there's a lot to be learned. I remember hearing someone talk about, you know, reading almost against yourself sometimes. So we're in this tradition, so let's make sure we sort of spend time learning, you know, from other traditions, rather than just going, oh no, you know, what they do is wrong, you know, we just like our thing. But actually learning and listening and learning to other contexts. You know, so we might go to you know, some church expression and be like, wow, those guys know how to celebrate, you know, it's just amazing, like such joy, and we can learn from that. And we can go to the contemplative and we can say, oh, those guys know how to sit in discomfort, and we can learn from that. And or, you know, if we could go to sort of a higher church expression and go, those guys know how to sit with mystery, and we could learn from that, you know. And then another context, and it's like, those guys know how to do this thing. And I think that thing of just trying to sort of be quite open, I think that's something in the Vineyard, I think we've been quite good at, sort of taught to sort of love the whole church, you know, and see beauty and wonderful things in the whole church, and strength in the church. I think probably, you're right, maybe in our context or in our style of church, maybe the temptation is towards like a buoyancy, which is which is a good thing, I think, in a lot of ways. But we sort of, I guess, and in our culture as a whole, I would say there's probably like keep, everything sort of like, let's try and keep it up here, and I think so we've sort of just almost been trying to be mindful of that and say, well, what can we build in, how can we build other things in. So one thing we've done more recently is we've had more prayers on a Sunday for the world and for our own situations, and just to sort of just to recognize that this is we do this, we gather together and we worship, but we do, and we celebrate, and we also all these things, but with real lives, in the real world. That this isn't a moment where we just pretend that everything's fine, and it's not disconnected from the rest of life. It's not disconnected from what's happening overseas, and awful and horrible things. So there's a sense where we've tried to do that, and I think we were talking with the worship leaders the other day, just about lament, like what songs do we have that express lament, and there's not very many, actually. It's quite kind of, and that's sort of, we've almost noticed that as a gap, like maybe we need some more songs that give voice to that. But I do think we make space often in the length of worship, in ministry time, like the emphasis on come as you are. There's not like, you don't have to dress up, put on your best face, but there's this invitation to just honesty. Honesty and vulnerability are what lead to intimacy. They create the space for intimacy, and that's always where we're going with worship, like how we want this to be a place of intimacy with the Lord. And so I think there's a number, there's loads that we could get better at, but I think there's a real desire to sort of, how do we do this? And I know you've living with Lost Cafe and a number of other remembrance services and things where we just go, how do we create space and prefer those among us who are really in a hard place, and recognize and come alongside them. And so I think that's
and it's where small groups are so important,
because so important. Yeah,
they're the spaces where people can come and not be okay.
Yeah,
and that's okay. And it's so, they're just so important. We have those smaller spaces where we can do that with one another.
So just quickly, as we sort of come into land, I think we've talked long, but as quickly as we come into, if we just, what does it actually mean to build a habit out of these things? So what does it look like how do we do that, and what does that look like, John?
So I think in some ways having it can be helpful to have some, when we think of like what we've had as a series, it might be that people might want to just look at that and not think, I've now got a shopping list of 6 sermons I've now got to add to everything in my life, but to maybe just sit down and just reflect on those different practices, thinking of maybe what are 1 or 2 things. So it might be something like something around silence and solitude. It might be something around Bible reading, whatever it might be, that just makes space to allow for this celebration to happen.
Yeah.
So not to think, I now have this new task that I've got to add to life, but it's finding some simple practices. And it might be 5 minutes a day, it might be 10 minutes a day, that just allows for that to happen. And there's all sorts of resources around that, and prayers of examining, and all these different things that you can use, but not to see them as, this is something I need to add to my my diet. But it's what might be the 1 or 2 things that just allows me to connect with God and to connect with the reality of life.
That's great. What about you?
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's important to remember why we do it. It's for our good. It's for our healthy growth as disciples of Jesus. And I think it's really important that it's authentic and genuine and comes from a deep, heartfelt, genuine place. And so, I just do encourage that in that space, like ask God, what is the tilt, towards the sun, like using that solar panel image. I think it's really powerful. What's the 1 degree tilt I could make that would make all that difference a year from now? I think with celebration, I think you gave a great example earlier, Dave, of, when you're out complaining on the dog walk, and it's like, what's the one thing I can do to tilt my heart towards gratitude in this moment? I can be thankful for the breath I breathe that gives me air to this complaint. And I think that can be it could be as simple as that we start with in turning our hearts in gratitude. And it's authentic, isn't it? It's genuine, it's honest. I think, starting, particularly if you are in a difficult place and gratitude's hard to find, or it's just not perhaps been in your sort of thought process. I think just kind of looking for the constants in life that, we can be thankful for, the things that are in the everydayness, in the mundaneness, and just begin there. I think there's real power in speaking things aloud. I think you talked about neurobiology earlier and sort of how it retrains our brains, literally. It renews our minds to think differently as we express gratitude. And there's similar scientific proof that as we speak these things aloud, that the strengthening of those, that retraining of our brain happens. And so personally for me, like speaking things aloud, speaking out my thank yous, my gratitudes, I think that's a really powerful thing to do. God often uses people to meet our needs and to show his love and care for us. And so we might find we can be thankful for just the people in our lives, or, I always say I feel really loved when someone makes me a cup of tea. And so just being thankful to the person who made me a drink, it can be really, really small. And I would just encourage, in building of any practice, starting where you are with what you've got, like that image of, Andrew with the loaves and fish, offer it to Jesus. He'll receive with great gratitude our offering, and it will be multiplied.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so helpful. I think the gratitude thing's really good. And I was just thinking, even just having the space each day, like whether that's through like an Ignatian kind of thing where, at the end of the day, you just pause and you just reflect on the day, like what's gone well, what hasn't, what am I feeling, just building moments in the morning before the day and in the evening after the day where you just give your heart space to feel and give the Lord space to speak. And I think, and in those moments, just having some questions, like one question I often ask myself in prayer is like, what's the most honest thing I could say to God in this moment? Like, what's the most honest thing I could possibly say to him in this moment? And there's something about that that's quite helpful. And I think I find it's like it creates vulnerability, which then creates intimacy, like I was saying a few times. But it's the most honest thing I could say. And then I think that thing of mindful of like what am I grateful for? I'm just going to go through a few things. But finding finding some space and then intentionality around the thoughts that you ask yourself, I think are really helpful. And then maybe, where you can, to do that in community, do that in, a smaller group of others with like once a week we communicate, we ask each other these questions, or once a week I, get to share vulnerably and honestly about what's going on and we pray for each other. I think is helpful. And then I think find some like different resources. So that's just as we close, I think any things that you would recommend. One thing I've always found very helpful is this little book of liturgy called Every Moment Holy. I've read it a few times on a Sunday and it's just lovely. There's a liturgy for everything. I mean, it's very random. There's a liturgy for beekeeping and a liturgy for making coffee and, all these things. But there's several books in it, and there's a liturgy for, there's one that's to do with liturgies for grieving and death. And there's liturgies for celebration. But just sometimes when you just don't have the words, and it's helpful to be able to sort of just follow in someone else's footsteps, to use other people's words, just that trail has been blazed and I don't have to fight it. I don't have to make it myself. I can just walk where someone else has walked before me. So Every Moment Holy is helpful. I think the Richard Foster book that we've based a number of these disciplines on, Celebration Discipline, is really helpful. Anya Nguyen is very helpful in many of these things, but a contemplative writer. Anything else, John?
So I found Tim Keller really helpful. Slightly different, maybe style to maybe Henry Nouwen,
Walking with God through
pain and suffering, and he's written a number of other books around that subject. There's a book called Sacred Rhythms, which is by Ruth Haley Barton, and that's more around some of the spiritual practices. But that's I know that I found it helpful, and I know others have as well. And then there's on the VCUKI website, there's a load of resources that, some of these prayer practices that you think, I don't even know how to start with it. But there's a load of resources on the VCUKI website which help you with those. And again, it's not to, I've got to do these things. It's but you might find one that is, that just helps me to begin to do that noticing God in the moments of life.
It's
great.
Last year in our small group, we felt like we really need to make room for going into the discomfort of looking at lament and unanswered prayer. And it felt like a brave and bold thing to do, but it was really welcomed by the group. And so I'd really recommend Pete Gregg's Unanswered Prayer course, which you can find on 24/7 website, and his accompanying book called God on Mute, which if, you're finding you having this sense of where's God, or, just even what's it like to hold my faith in the space of difficult, challenging times or the time of lament, it can really help with that sort of forming of language and just opening up the subject with other people in a safe place to just sort of journey through that together.
Then that's great. And there's one final book that is a little bit different, sort of, but I think is really interesting. A book called The Critical Journey, which isn't exactly about spiritual habits or anything like that. It's more sort of based around this idea that as we follow Jesus through, for lifelong following of Jesus, there will be different points in our journey, different stages, if you like, and different authors have different amount of stages that they put in it, that sort of kind of recognizably different to other stages, and different things will be helpful at different points. And so it might be that, lament is particularly important at one point, and celebration at another, or but just a sort of recognition that that as we journey through life with Jesus, we will go through different things, and God will be doing different things in us in different moments. And it's a kind of way of just recognizing something of where you are at. And it might be that there's, when I was first a Christian, these things really made me feel like I was, drew me close to the Lord. But for some reason, those things aren't functioning in quite the same way. And the encouragement in the book really is that, there's an invitation of the Lord into something else in that moment. And so, and I think with all of these things, having something of that in mind is quite helpful, I think, because rather than sort of feeling worried, what's gone wrong, you can actually begin to sort of say, okay, well, I'm in the Lord's hands. He's the potter, I'm the clay, and I can trust him. And maybe there's some stuff here that helps me just recognize that he's with me and he's at work. And our practices then and things we do might shift a little bit, or some might become more important than others at various times along that journey. And so the critical journey is a really interesting book to engage with. So Steph, John, thanks so much for your time. Really, really appreciate that. And really hope for everyone listening there's been some helpful things in there. So thank you.